curiosity about a wide-ranging questions rooted in a variety of fields. TMI is a secular, liberal arts academic institution that offers university-level discussion courses, as well as other opportunities for lifelong learning. Please visit our website to learn about the fascinating courses that will be offered this fall. Our webinar is entitled Capitalism, COVID-19, and a New Way Forward, a conversation with Julius Grey. I'm delighted to inform you that there are over 300 people that are attending this webinar this evening. Thank you for your interest. In the first part of the conversation, Maître Julius Grey will be interviewed by two prominent members of the Thomas More community. This will be followed by a question and answer period. Maître Grey has kindly offered to answer questions which you, in attendance through Zoom, will have formulated. To send your questions, you'll have to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, please check that you have found the Q&A function. It should be right in the middle, on the bottom of your screen. Write your question either in French or in English and send it to us, and I will pose it as best I can to Professor Grey. This event is being recorded and will eventually become available on YouTube. The interviewers this evening are Dr. Pamela Butler, who is a member of the Thomas More Institute Curriculum Committee. Pam was a professional dancer with the American Ballet Theatre and with the Joffrey Ballet Company, which permitted her to visit different parts of the world. She subsequently pursued graduate studies and became a professor of political science and liberal arts at Marianapolis College here in Montreal. Mr. Martin Baenninger is a member of the Thomas More Institute Board of Directors, a retired senior international business executive. Martin is the author of several books. The most recent is entitled On the Scent of a Continent, Memoirs of Africa. Martin is the co-founder of the group Pluridis, which helps out young entrepreneurs. He also serves on the boards of the Centre International d'Art Contemporain and of the Art for Healing Foundation. We're honored to welcome, albeit remotely, Maître Julius Grey, who is a well-known Montreal lawyer and professor. In fact, he taught me administrative law at McGill Law School over 40 years ago. He is a committed human rights activist and has recently authored a book entitled Capitalism and the Alternatives. The excerpts from this book, which were sent to you, will have enabled you to appreciate the timely character of the topic which Professor Grey addresses. This is especially true as we are still collectively feeling the impact of the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. Furthermore, in the last few days, we have witnessed expressions of indignation and protest following the violent deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. The video recordings of their deaths have brought forcefully to our conscience the racism pervading our societies. But where does capitalism fit into this picture? It would seem that Western capitalist countries have failed in important regards to protect their citizens, both from the pandemic and from the impact of racism. Are these failures rooted in the very structures of contemporary capitalism? What solutions is Professor Grey proposing to correct these failures? Will his proposals succeed in promoting a stronger social compact to help us face other potential crises? Are there principles that may guide us into the future? It is with pleasure that I invite Dr. Pam Butler and Mr. Martin Baenninger to lead off the conversation. Grey, à vous.
Thank you very much, Brian, and good evening, Maître Grey. I'm Martin Baenninger. Pam Butler and I are delighted to have the opportunity this evening to chat with you about your new book, Capitalism and the Alternatives, against the backdrop of this very strange pandemic world we are currently living in. The papers are full of nothing but COVID-19, and to jump right in at the deep end of our interview tonight, and to lead into Pam's first question for you, we cite a recent headline from the Financial Times, namely, "Virus puts responsible capitalism to the test." Food for thought indeed. And Pam, perhaps you would like to continue.
Sure. Maitre Grey, we are so happy to have you join us for this very special event. This is brand new for us, and we've never had anything quite like it, and we're delighted that you're the first person to be with us. I enjoyed your book very much, by the way. We're using an excerpt from it that everyone will have a chance to read, but I recommend it to everyone. It's very thought-provoking, and our questions derive mostly from the snippet that we were allowed to read, but I suggest everybody read the whole book. It's well worth it. So the first question that I would propose is a two-pronged one, and you can decide whether you want to answer them together or separately. It goes as follows. What do you see as the major failures of Western capitalist countries to protect their citizens during the pandemic? And then linked to that, what is inherent in the nature of capitalism that has led to these failures?
I think it's really the same question. The problem is not what the countries have done to protect citizens. Some countries, like Canada, and some European countries, not Britain, but Canada, have done reasonably well in spending money to make sure that nobody starves and so on. But the problem, well, that COVID-19 has brought out is the periodic failure of neoliberalism. Ever since its success under Thatcher and Reagan, first of all, the people who supported it said, well, this is the end of history. We've now got the perfect system which will go on forever. But in fact, it's collapsed every 10 years, whether it's the Wall Street speculation, whether it's real estate bubbles or COVID. Of course, it didn't cause COVID, but every time that something happens, the system has to be bailed out. So the theory that you don't need the state, that you can allow everything to private enterprise has been proved wrong over and over again. In fact, this system has failed. It has failed because every time something goes wrong, the state has to come in and we have to re-socialize it. Obama nationalized Wall Street, of course, Trump has undone it afterwards. Now the Canadian government and many other governments have basically spent billions of dollars in making sure people go on. It's obviously a total failure. The second part, which is a failure, and we see that now, is, you know, we can live without so many things. The essence of capitalism is a sort of feeding frenzy, growth, growth, growth. Every year, that's how you become more prosperous and you get more things, most of which are unnecessary. And, you know, we can live without it. I've noticed I can live without outings, without so many restaurants and so on. The problem is you can't live with them. If other people have them, if other people get the elite schools, as Betsy DeVos would like, if other people have the feeding frenzy, and we don't. So most people don't. So obviously, what COVID has taught us, on the one hand, is that this system doesn't work. And secondly, that we don't need the growth worship. And in fact, the third thing that COVID has told us, because COVID is different from Wall Street and everything else, it has an environmental side. The next catastrophe could be a far worse one, involving sea levels, climates, fires, and so on. Unless we accept that the state will step in and do things, we're going to face an even worse catastrophe.
Having said all that, Maitre Grey, I noted one area in your writing where there might be something of a conflict. Indeed, you say that the neoliberalism that characterizes current governments has created, and I quote, a soft totalitarianism of surveillance, harsh criminal law, and enforced conformism. As unappealing as that may sound, are such regimes, in fact, not better equipped to meet challenges such as COVID?
They may be better equipped for an immediate emergency, just like during a war. You may be better equipped to do something of that sort. But such regimes are an absolute threat to civil liberties, to independent thought. And what has happened, which is very peculiar in the neoliberal period, is that the totalitarianism has affected both the right. When you look at financial pages and there's only one opinion, la pensée unique. Pensée unique, you've got to cut expenses and so on. And they're already saying, if you read them, that after this, we're going to have to cut expenses and cut taxes again. And the so-called left, because people are competing for less and less of certain things, university matters and so on, each group stakes out a claim that it should be the winner, and therefore you have this massive movement towards political correctness and towards a single type of thought, where there are very few subjects on which people now tolerate different opinions.
Right, very interesting. Moving away from COVID-19 for a minute, because I think we've had enough of it for a little while, and looking more broadly at your thinking and the content of your book, I would be interested to hear you tell us what brought an end to the social democracy, which you see as having been the prevailing economic regime of the 1950s and 60s. You speak of that period very glowingly, but then it comes to an end, and I wonder why you see that as having happened.
Well, Les Trente Glorieuses, as Piketty put it, yes, I think it was a very good period. It was a period in which the world was getting better, but no period is perfect and lasts forever. And there were a number of contradictions in that period. First of all, some of the spending was stupid and excessive, and people didn't realize that you had to be relatively careful when you are providing universal programs, not to waste some of that. The second problem was that many of the people who were raised from poverty or from relatively humble backgrounds, once they got there, didn't want to share it with the next group. They were not interested in paying high taxes in order to get the next group of immigrants up and so on. And I think that definitely contributed to the end of that period. But the other thing was that the forces of the capitalism were always well-financed and so on. And one of the things that stopped them from fighting during the 30 years was the fear of communism, the fear that there was an alternative. If people didn't get Medicare and so on, if they didn't get it Clement Attlee's way, they might try to get it Joe Stalin's way. And therefore, as long as there was an alternative, which was a bad alternative, it didn't work, they didn't do they were not prepared to try to cut expenses and so on. But as soon as this ended, the desire to increase profits, to give everything to corporations increased. There were some other things. Mr. Rocard, the former premier of France, said one of the terrible developments in the 70s and 80s was the growth of influence of the shareholders. The companies thought that their only responsibilities, there was no social responsibility, it's to maximize profits, when in fact their responsibility is a mixed one, to the shareholders, sure, to the workers as well, to the public as well, and to the state. And so I think the system got tired, and the system was ready to be taken, and it was taken. And we can't restore it entirely, but we can get another system that does some of the things that social democracy did.
So you partially answered my next question, which was to say that continuing on the same tack, what in turn were the causes, in your view, of the gradual transition to the dominance of neoliberalism? And if I understand you correctly, you think it's because it's the sort of coming of age of the immigrant population which did better and wanted to preserve what they had, and such things as Thatcherism were happily able to exploit that sort of feeling. Is that correct?
In part. What I do say in another part of the book, not the one you give out, is that it's obvious that populations are not always generous. We can't be complete idealists and think that people are kind and nice, and if you put out a nice program, it'll always win. It'll sometimes win. There are some seminal elections. I think seminal elections were in the United States, 1860, Britain, 1945, when things happened. but we have to remember that when given the choice during a terrible crisis, unemployment and so on, when the German electorate was given the choice between the SPD, which wanted a sort of decent socialism, the KPD, which wanted to go much further, and I think much too far, but nevertheless was not proposing to kill a neighbor, and Hitler, you know what they chose.
Right, yeah, indeed, yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Well, Pam's next question is going to take us into the realm of another notable current event, namely the murder of the United States citizen George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
Pam?
Right. Well, when we embarked on this, we were just thinking of COVID. That's why it's at the title. But so much has been happening recently that it seems to us we have two crises to deal with. So we thought we'd put that in your lap, that what would you see as the solutions to both the COVID crisis and to the racial crisis that's going on within the capitalist system, or without, however the capitalist system might need to be changed.
Without the capitalist system, with a system which maintains, in my view, a lot of private enterprise,
right,
but which is not capitalist in its orientation or ideology. Well, here is what I thought I was going to get me into trouble with the left, so-called left, as I call them. I believe, of course, one of the basic principles is equality of all people and anti-racism. Racism has been one of the worst things we've had, and so on. But I think it works two ways. I believe in the end, if there are powerful groups and they advocate for themselves, first of all, they do not necessarily want to share. I've already given that problem if they win, but they also create resentment if they lose. My idea is not to promote government by groups, not to promote identity, but rather individualism. I call it romantic individualism, where each person is an individual and is free in a society to marry whom he wants. Of course, we've had a lot of that about gender equality, but also whom he wants, whether his ethnic groups approves of it or not, to choose a profession, to do what he or she wants, and not to remain in groups. One of the great dangers to democracy in general is lobbies and lobbyism. Because as we see right now, governments are powerless to deal with a lobby that demands something and has a considerable number of votes. So my idea is romantic individualism, and therefore the way to deal with racism is to promote equality of individuals. And in that way, it's different from certain socialist theories which are collectivist in nature. What I think is there are no collective rights, there are individual rights. They have to be collectively defended. You have to redistribute in a very radical way, and I propose both a minimum income and a maximum income so that the difference can never be that great. But in the end, I am not in favor of a government of lobbies. I'm not very sympathetic towards the multicultural idea. I think people should be free to merge and mix. And that would eventually, I think, end the sort of horror that we've been watching in the United States. I can tell you from my own experience as a lawyer, I've done a lot of police brutality cases, and I must say, unfortunately, 70% or 75% of the people who were brutalized were Black. So we know that even in a city like ours, where there isn't the traditional hate, that's there. And in the end, I hope through individualism and individual freedom and the sort of romanticism of life, we'll be able to dilute the feeling of identity, which I think is on the whole not a good thing.
That came out loud and clear in your book. The other thing that comes out very strongly is that you support very strong economic regulation. You think it's a very important role for government to control the economy, to distribute wealth equal with greater equality, and so on. But I was wondering how you would, and the second part of that is that the government leaves everything else alone, that we leave the citizens to decide for themselves what they're going to do with their lives and what beliefs they hold. So my question is, what would you think about health regulation in the middle of a pandemic? Do you think the government has the right to force us to wear masks when we go into a grocery store or other things, or is this an individual decision? Where do you stand on that one?
In the middle of a pandemic, yes. Just like in the middle of the bombing of London, it was perfectly reasonable to tell people you can't turn on your lights at night because that'll guide the Luftwaffe pilots. And I'm sure there were similar regulations in Berlin, probably enforced by worse measures. But the type of redistribution, and it's not true that there is no danger, that we can be idealists and say that's fine. There will be free from unnecessary regulation. In other words, what you want to do is reconcile, on the one hand, equality, which to me is mostly economic equality. I'm not worried about groups or whatever, worried about every person being within that range, but also liberty. And the Soviet experiment teaches us the judicial review is essential. So during a pandemic, you may well envisage special powers. During war, like the one against Hitler, you may well envisage regulations that enforce things. Now, even during a pandemic and so on, you have to have certain limits. If they, for instance, said that you will not treat certain people because we can't afford it, I think that would be beyond the limit and there would be a charter application. But we must make certain that after the pandemic, those powers don't remain. And one thing that we have to remember is if in 1940, you had the power to trace people, or 41, that exists right now, there would be hardly a single Jew alive in France today, when in fact about 75% survived because they didn't have that sort of power. Because today all they do is spend 1 year getting biometric statistics about them, and then every time you went through a door, an alarm bell would ring saying he's there. So you have to be very careful about the dangers of this technology and leave the possibility of judicial review at all times, even if it frustrates the government, even if it frustrates somebody like myself who had a great idea and this is what he'd want to enforce, and some judge would tell him you can't, you've got to leave that there.
I think a good example of the danger you evoke is the Patriot Act in the United States, which was invoked at the time of 9/11 and which is still there. You know.
And in general, the United States is an example of the dangers to liberty of a country which in the past, and despite slavery, with a horror greater than words can express, did make a contribution to liberty and so on. And if you read 19th century European literature, many people looked to America because it was freer in some ways and so on. But that country has, first of all, increased the gap between rich and poor more than others. And that's a natural consequence. You have to enforce it. So they're enforcing it. And the way they enforce it is through the carceral state, through vast numbers of people being in prison, largely, but not entirely black. And there it is.
Yeah.
I'd love to pick up on something that you just touched on, multiculturalism, because you spend a good bit of time on that in your book, explaining the Western culture, other immigrants coming in, bringing in their cultures, and how you see that mix as opposed to multiculturalism, which has been the kind of credo for Canada forever. I'd love it if you could expand on that a bit.
Well, for one thing, I don't believe any culture in the world, many cultures have made tremendous contributions. And in the past, not today so much. They've been separate from each other. The contact, say, between China and France was very little. And in one of China's great novels of the 18th century, the hero is explaining to the two heroines that there is a country called France where they do something, someplace they hardly knew anything about it, because countries were apart from each other. But when people come into a society, if you maintain culture, what you actually do is you empower the groups, the leaders of the groups, who then find that they can get subsidies, they can get trips, they can get influence. And the people do not mix as much. What I would like is for people to bring in their cultural richness. I don't for a moment think that only Western things should be there. We were speaking before, for instance, to my mind, one of the great novels of all time, which is hardly known in the West, is Lady Murasaki's Tales of Genji. I'd like it to become generally known. I think those people who came from Japan should have brought this extraordinary work, which is, I don't know of any other 11th century work which reads that way, there isn't anything old-fashioned or strange about it. And I think other cultures could bring it too. And look at what the African culture has contributed to American music. So I think by bringing these things and having a new culture emerge for every generation, and you always have people who are different because you have immigration coming in and so on. Those people, first generation people never quite fully integrate. I mean, my parents never lost their accents and so on. But by mixing and bringing in, you create a new culture which is shared by everybody. The aesthetics, the religious thought, the philosophical thought, even the scientific thought. You bring in all of those things and they're together. And as I said, I always believe that ultimately no society can remain united if there are barriers to marriage. One of the examples that you would give is Spain during the Muslim era, where the three groups, the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, lived fairly well together. But there was an absolute rule: they didn't intermarry. They didn't intermarry. First of all, Muslim women were off-bound because that was the rule. And in general, they didn't. And in the end, it broke down. Both the Jews and the Muslims were expelled, to Spain's loss, and to Europe's loss. I think you have to have a society of mixing in families, mixing in culture, and every generation will create its own mix. And that is why I don't like nationalism of the dominant group. I don't think it should enforce a vision of some culture that existed at some place in the 19th century and has to be maintained. And I don't like smaller groups forming their own mirror image of that.
Okay. Martin has a question that goes right back. Sorry. Excuse me, Martin.
Say, Maitre Grey, it would seem that you're more in favor of America's melting pot approach as opposed to Canada's mosaic approach.
I wouldn't say America's melting pot, because America has a great and gaping failure with its non-integration of the African population. I would say perhaps France. France before now, because the last 20, 30 years have been very difficult for France, and we wonder what's going to happen with the integration of the North African population. But in general, France is a country which did mix. For instance, in the 20th century, many people have complained after the Dreyfus affair that France was quite anti-Semitic and so on. But is there any other country that had 5 Jewish premiers in the course of the 20th century, except, of course, that if you had approached Mr. Mendes France or Mr. Blum, he would have said, I'm a Frenchman. I'm the same type of Frenchman that the other guy is. Maybe once a year I go to another place, that's all.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting, yeah. Pam, what do you think? Shall I move into the 5
absolutely. We have a couple of questions at the end, but we're expecting you to expound on this one quite extensively. So go ahead, Martin.
This one is really based on the fact that you say that young people are pressured by parents to achieve material success, and this is certainly true. But in the shadow of that, you have no illusions about how difficult it will be to promote the more personal, romantic attitude to living advocated through your 5 pillars. How likely do you think it is that the 5 pillars of your envisaged new system are put into place, and particularly the one imposing a maximum income? And what could lead to this happening?
Well, you know, it's not an either-or proposition. I don't think any idea has ever been put to complete, has had complete fruition. I'm not going to compare myself to either Adam Smith or Karl Marx. I'm not in that league. But their ideas were not applied totally either. But you can have some of it. I think you can legislate, and you will have to legislate. In a world of environment difficulties, and now there's much talk about the present, the millennial generation not having the opportunities we had. You are going to have to equalize. And whether you do it the way I suggested, which is a maximum income, or a maximum level of income, not a total maximum, but very much so, or whether you do it in other ways, I think it is achievable, and it will be necessary. The differences, and that's the terrible thing about recent America. I already referred to Mrs. DeVos. I think it's one of the most terrible things to try to deprive those who are already deprived of the equal chance of an education. It's also, and I often said that people should go to the same schools. I don't like, you know, one of the thoughts I've always had was to amend the Education Act to say all children between the ages of 5 and 17 will attend public school. Mm-hmm. And you could have religion, you know, I believe in freedom. You can have religious instruction after school. You can even provide it in the building after school for those parents who want it. You can have special schools for people who are musically gifted or people who have handicaps. But I think they should all be in the same school, meeting and mixing. And in fact, even for Quebec, my solution is to have French and English schools, of course, because they're guaranteed and so on, but to have a third system, which runs about 80% in French, 75% in French, open to everybody, so people could meet and mix. I think that will lead to a great degree of equalizing. Now, when it comes to romanticism, you said romanticism towards women. Well, that's me. I've always had a very romantic vision of men and women, but it's both ways. In a romantic vision of men, a romantic vision of women. The idea that romance is one of the basic things in life. And, you know, I always keep going back to novels in my book. And I keep talking about Dickens or about Tolstoy or about Lady Murasaki. And of course, the novel is a mirror of life. It allows you to live many lives and understand what a single life would not make you understand. But the fundamental questions in the novels are life and death, politics and power, and love. And those are the 3 fundamental issues that have to be debated.
Great.
Indeed, yeah.
Well, thank you. And Brian, I think the only other question I have is going to backtrack. This interview has had a certain momentum, which I think has gone really well. And I don't want to just plug in another question to plug in another question. So what do you think, Brian?
Well, I have a few questions.
Okay.
Our over 300 people that are in attendance, and I've received a few questions. Some of these questions have been already addressed by Patriot Grey, but I do want to bring a few to his attention. For example, one question that was posed in different ways is, can our society, can our economy really afford a basic income? Something like you were suggesting. Is that something that's doable in our current economic system?
Well, surely it is. I mean, we do have a minimum that we don't allow, even in our system. We have a minimum below which people can't fall, which is the welfare limit. There are ways of maintaining this equality through social programs, free education and free health, which are essential. So we can ensure a certain basic minimum level. And I think that's not the only thing we're trying to ensure. The tax system has the purpose also of equalizing, not only of providing the minimum, but also making certain that classes are not formed. My system, because it leaves private enterprise, obviously allows some people to be wealthier than others, but how much wealthier? And my theory, and I don't have a precise figure because obviously it'll vary from time to time, my answer to that is not enough to be in a different class. It is important that the children of the president of the company and the children of the cleaner in the company still go to the same schools, have contact with each other, not be in a world in which one never sees each other behind in gated communities and in gated resorts, the privileged live and the others are like George Orwell's crows. So to me, the issue, and that's where the influence of Karl Marx comes in, to prevent the formation of classes. You can have differences. It doesn't make a different class if I have 10,000 less or more than a friend who went to law school with me. That doesn't put us into a different class. But if somebody has billions and I have very little, then we never meet and and in the end, of course, he gets an undue influence on the society and he's not interested in the institutions that cater to the weak or the poor. He doesn't need them. He doesn't use them at all. And so we do have the means of limiting wealth to so that there be no hard and fast class barriers.
Right. Interesting.
Another person in attendance has raised the following point. This person recognizes that business corporations need to make a decent profit. And many companies, many corporations that are making a good profit have shown that they have been socially responsible, taking care not only of their employees, but also their clients, the environment, and contributing in many different ways to the promotion of society. Well, I'm thinking about your principles that you set out at the end of the excerpt that you shared with us. What would you say are the optimal conditions that allow a business corporation to be a good citizen, a good corporate citizen?
Well, one of the conditions would be that it would be catering both to a public and to workers and to shareholders who are in a state of relative equality, where there may well be disputes about the precise division, and there would be, and there'd be judicial review to determine how it's done, but there would not be this gap. I don't vilify business. If I did, I wouldn't suggest that we leave free enterprise for most of the economy. I'm too well aware of the failures of the Soviet Union to think that we're going to nationalize everything and run it that way. But I think some companies have been responsible, and everybody knows that Bill Gates has done all sorts of things for people. Other companies have not. And one of the problems in modern neoliberalism is the tremendous disparity between productivity and income. For instance, speculators, people who sit there trading in stocks as the dawn rises in Japan, Europe, etc., make much more than teachers, nurses. Doctors do okay, but teachers and nurses and other people whose contribution to the society is far greater. So some companies are socially responsible. Some companies care about the environment. But one thing has to be said, in a pure competition thing, they can't really. Now, the expression I use is, if you get eaten, you're not there next year. So the companies are forced to do all sorts of things. I said that good, kind capitalism is something as imaginary as a vegetarian lion. And that's, I don't think that'll work. But some companies are more responsible than others, and they do what they can. Others are not. But we have to correct the disparity between, look at Quebec right now during COVID, the nurses' aides, the immigrants who had no rights, etc., and who rolled up their sleeves and went to work in danger and so on, where other people were raking in millions and giving themselves bonuses, which did not reflect their contribution to society. So I think, yes, companies can be responsible, and yes, we'll leave private enterprise, and yes, they will make a reasonable profit, but we can have this sort of fairly equal society, and one that values contribution as much as quick reactions on buying and selling on a computer.
A number of the participants who are sending in their questions have wanted to know a little bit more about your idea that you describe as romantic individualism. For example, some people are concerned that your focus on romantic individualism may not be pragmatic. It might not be able to deal with phenomena such as racism that targets groups. Of course, groups are made up of individuals, but it does not really focus on the reality of collective transformation. And this may be true, for example, in respect of, let's say, a discriminated, minorities that are discriminated against, whether it be Black population or indeed Indigenous people. How do you see romantic individualism as being a mindset that deals with the need for collective change?
Well, it's not, of course, a solution that will bear fruit in 5 years. Obviously, for instance, racism has been difficult to kill throughout the world, everywhere. And you see that groups, all groups, including the previous victims, suddenly show signs of discrimination and injustice. I don't want to get into the Middle East debate, but it's obvious that these things happen. But I think if you leave the reason why the groups are in competition is because things are unequally distributed, because they figured we've got to get more for our group. For instance, I say the political correctness and the harshness of modern university is directly related to the withdrawal of funds for the difficulty. First of all, we know that most scientists, most even arts people spend half their time filling out grant applications. That is the major thing, but there isn't enough to go around, and there aren't enough university jobs to go around, and so on. And that's why the various groups are pushing to have their members. If you had a society in which there was not that terrible economic pressure for groups, and in which children went to school together and married in groups that are not orthodox and so on, then I think the groups would, and I'd use an old Marxist term, wither away. In the end, the groups would not be there. And there would be, of course, groups, because new immigrants would come in and would be groups, and there would be individually, people have different interests. I mean, I don't have an illusion that everybody has quite the same rather conservative cultural interests that I do, classical music or 19th century novels or Shakespeare. But I think people would get into groups, and freedom of association tells you that, but there would not be the need for the groups in order to survive. So I say in the end that, of course, everybody recognizes that malignant nationalism is a bad thing. Hitler, the reductio ad Hitlerum. Nobody wants to have another Hitler. But I say what is difficult for people to accept is that all communitarianism is not a good thing. It's obviously not as bad. It's obviously not murderous. It's obviously not frightening. But in the end, it would be better if people had their own individual identity based on their interests, on their loves, on their thoughts, and not on groups that are organized in order to try to get the most out of a society.
A number of participants have been interested in what you had to say about our educational system. Many of people that I'm indicated they like your idea about meeting and mixing, with these kinds of innovations that you're speaking about, what happens to the idea of private schools, to the idea of, for example, parents having a choice regarding the kind of education that their community has wanted to pass on to upcoming generations? I know you alluded to this earlier in an answer to, I think, Pam's question, but some of the people that are communicating with us here are raising this issue. What do you think about, should private schools be abolished finally?
I think there should be no private schools. I think there could be private courses, and whether it's religion or language and so on after school, and it could be encouraged. I mean, you know, if I'm very happy that my Polish is as good as it ever was, even though I don't live in Polish anymore. And I think other people could keep their Italian, Spanish. It enriches everybody. But at the same time, I think we would be better off if people were together. Now, there's one thing I do want to stress. I am far from being anti-Quebec, because somebody would say that's mixing freedom of choice. No, I think a society can choose a language. It can't refuse the other language. It has to allow citizens to speak both. But that's why I said that my ideal system in Quebec, the third system, would be 75, 80% in French to maintain French, but at the same time, to mix everybody and to prevent a creation of a state in which people don't know each other. You know, one of the things I've noticed, having grown up here, first of all, my own experience, I was totally Polish for the first 9 years of my life. Then I became an English Montrealer and with a certain degree of Jewish background, though I never went for that. Then I had a period in the 80s, which was my Francization, so that I really became a different person, yet not certain where his allegiances were. And I think everybody can go through that. We can have different periods of our lives. We can be more French or more English at one time. We can be more or less religious. We can be whatever. And the idea of hard and fast groups is not good, is not, I think, propitious for a good society.
Now, one person has pointed out that in the new culture created by the mix of each generation, something that you seem to be advocating, well, what's the role of tradition? What is the role of the core values that are espoused by not just a family, not just groupe d'appartenance?
Well, first of all, I believe in freedom of association, individual rights. Freedom of association includes the right to form an ethnic group if you want to. I always say that there are people who will not accept my mix. In the Middle Ages, there were people who went to beguinage and to monasteries, etc., because they didn't want to mix. Today, it may well be, for instance, that certain groups, the Hasidim, the very religious Muslims, will remain, and the only answer is benevolence. You get all the social programs, etc., and we will see what your children say. Though I don't agree in allowing them to not instruct their children in, say, science, or because then you create victims. But I think in the end, tradition is given more value than it actually has. And if you do wide reading of different literatures, if you read Lady Murasaki, they're not different from us. They're 11th century. There are certain differences of approach, differences of the way you say things, the way you do things, but there isn't that much difference on the fundamental questions of good and evil. And it's an intuitive thing that all people have. So that the idea, and you know, when it comes to family, every group claims that it has this particular family thing. You read in family law courses, people arguing that my Jewish background means I have a special attitude towards family. But then you find the same thing in another case where somebody claims that he has to bring up his child Italian because they have a special family, or French Canadian because it has a special family. There was a Supreme Court case in the 50s when that argument was made by the Quebec judges, but they were minority in the end. The answer is nobody has a monopoly on tradition, family, etc. And if you scratch the surface, you'll find that the differences are small. It's the leaders of the groups that all seek to capitalize on it. But in the end, people are determined very much about how they make their living, what they do. And for instance, in a place like Montreal, it could be French, English, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, but people basically live the same way. They work in the same way. They once again, the Marxist influence, the fundamental question, the economic question, and they're not that different. So that tradition does not lead to radical differences and so on. And if people mix, there's no tradition. In my family, my wife comes from a French-Canadian background. I was an immigrant from Poland with the Jewish background, and so on. And the children were brought up without any tradition, and yet they have their own tradition, their own morality, their own attitude.
Thomas More Institute offers many courses using contemporary literature or even the classics. And you mentioned that the novel is a mirror of life. Yet, is it possible that the novel is rather a mirror of the author's experience? And does that diminish the value of the novel, because it really is reflecting, the biases, the limitations of an author? How do you read novels?
Well, if you take any single author, of course, Dostoevsky was a nut. He was a nut of extraordinary genius, but he had ideas about Christ coming back to Russia, which are not generally shared by most people. So if you only looked at Dostoevsky, you'd get a very skewed view of what the world is like, although you can learn a lot from him about psychology, about people, about passion, and so on. But if you read many, then you do get an idea of what a reality is. And I think one of the problems in today's political correctness is that people haven't seen what other societies are like. So they try to apply our views and say, this person was completely wrong in the 18th century because, for instance, his attitude towards Jews or blacks was not exactly the same as ours. But if you read a lot, you'll see that it's a different experience that you can integrate in your own worldview and learn from it. That's what I found by reading novels, and not only novels. I think novels are necessarily the product of Gutenberg and the press. Before that, when people didn't read, it was plays. It was passion plays, it was whatever. But literature allows you to know the world much better than you could in your own life learn. I'm not suggesting it as an alternative to experience, but it's an enrichment of experience.
What you've just said is music to the ears of many of the members of the Thomas More community. But let's just explore a little bit more one of the points that you're making. Well, what do you think about, for example, different movements wanting to, for example, eliminate statues that celebrate for example, Confederate generals, or even you may have heard about recently, some people would like to do away with the statue of John A. McDonough.
Or Columbus, or Washington, or Jefferson.
Yeah, well, what do you think about this? I mean, in terms of...
I don't think we should wipe out the past. You remember in George Orwell, the past was wiped out. We were always at war with East Asia. We were always friends of Eurasia. And then all of a sudden it changes, and it has always been the other way around. I don't think we should wipe out the past. And I don't think that the fact that people did things or said things that were not standard or not good or not kind should prevent us from learning from them. It appears from records of the 14th century that Chaucer was accused of rape. It appears that certainly Caravaggio committed a murder. And yet the experience of Chaucer and Caravaggio and Wagner, who was very anti-Semitic, nevertheless enriches us. And sometimes these people have a feeling they don't put the worst things because they know deep down that is not universal. For instance, you won't find that the anti-Semitism in Wagner's operas. You'll find it in a couple of stupid essays, but he didn't put it into the operas because he probably knew that it would detract from the universal aspect of what he was doing. So we shouldn't be destroying the past. We can have statues of people, for instance, Peter the Great remained in St. Petersburg Petrograd, Leningrad, throughout the Soviet period, the statue was there. It's not a good idea to wipe out the past and to use current, it's being done basically because the groups are jostling for the extra advantages and so on. But I don't think that it is reasonable, for instance, to decapitate a statue of Christopher Columbus. First of all, there was no way that Europe in its state of technology was not going to expand. It would have happened one way or the other. And Columbus brought something we don't want to. Do you want to de-Hispanize America, to de-Anglicize, to de-Francicize? I don't think we can or should.
In your questions, you are rather severe towards what you call the left. And at one point, you rather provocatively asked questions about the whole thing about the political correctness that characterizes the left. And indeed, you relate this to perhaps certain tendencies in different social movements, including the Me Too movement. Could you address a little bit more your thoughts about the danger posed by political correctness?
I always say so-called left because I consider myself to be of the left, to be of the left that tried to equalize and socialize during the 19th and 20th century. I think, unfortunately, the political correctness destroys thought. And in particular, it is destroying an institution that I always considered essential, the university. I've loved the university. I loved being at McGill. I loved being at Oxford. I thought that anything could be said and thought. And I'll choose examples that where I tend to agree with the positions of those people who are politically correct, but I don't agree that they should be able to stop the debate. Look at abortion. I do believe it should be permitted, but I don't think that people should be punished for having said or even thinking. If somebody says, I'm Catholic and I can't take it, well, that's fine. You should be able to have a debate about any subject. I think the economic right should be permitted to say its piece and not be shut down because it disagrees. I think there are sometimes limits, the limits of hate, for instance, our society. That's where you get Adolf Hitler into the picture and you say that's beyond the pale. But in general, and let's go to Me Too. Me Too is obviously not a safe movement to have. It's not safe to punish people without a hearing. It's not safe to assume that one side is always saying the truth and the other is not. It is, on the other hand, a very good thing that women are going to be safer in the future, are not going to be victimized by bosses, by people who have power or influence, and so on. But that does not mean that we should proceed to shut down anybody who's accused. One of the best examples, of course, right now is Woody Allen. I think we should continue watching his films. Mm-hmm. I think it's one thing to appreciate the liberation of women in our times, and another to say that a mere accusation will shut down a career. That's not right. So what I would suggest, instead of the Me Too movement, and instead of what Quebec has just done, saying it's imprescriptible forever, you can sue for that, have a 3-year period, and beyond that, have what Mandela did in South Africa, truth and reconciliation. If you have an accusation, don't accuse and destroy the career, but confront and have a debate, discussion with the person so that we understand what happened and that it will never happen again. But I do not think that we should have a situation where anybody's career can be ended by an accusation.
Before going back to Pam and Martin for other questions, there was also another question that came out regarding Mark Zuckerberg. And more precisely, should Facebook, should Twitter limit what the President of the United States can and does communicate in his messages? Is there a responsibility on the part of social media to limit the freedom of speech.
Maybe in the extreme of hate. In the extreme of hate, if somebody's calling for a mob to finally do away with some group, that should not be there and not be encouraged. But on the whole, no. On the whole, I think it is dangerous to limit freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is, everybody agrees with freedom of expression. You'll rarely meet somebody who says there should be no freedom of expression. But everybody doesn't think it should be applied to his group. Each ethnic group says, no, but not about us. I was once yelled at by a group of nationalistic Italians because I compared Garibaldi to Levesque. And not for us. You can't compare us. We're different. And I think there should be no censorship. And what we have to work on is education, educating the public so that it not be such influence. Somebody said something stupid, so what? So he said it. And if people didn't pay such attention, if people weren't prepared to believe the worst of everybody, the worst that if you're accused of something, you've done it. If somebody says you're a thief, you're a thief. If people were a little more discriminating in how they, less discriminating against people, but more discriminating with respect to ideas, then sure, let them talk. As they say in French, cause toujours mon lapin. It will not have such an effect. But freedom of expression is fundamental to any society. Without freedom of expression, you can't change anything. If you have to take a chance to propose something new, then people won't take the chance.
Mm-hmm. I have many questions that are in the queue, but I want to give a chance to Martin and Pamela to perhaps pose a couple other questions that they've prepared. They're up the sleeve there.
Well, we had another one that I thought was very interesting. It was concerning, according to the new system that you advocate, how do you ensure through state action that inequality can decline if the same type of people, that is elites, are constantly elected to power? Or put another way, why do people seem to vote against their own economic self-interests over and over again?
Well, I say that, and I say that it's possible that we'll never get anywhere, that we shouldn't be rosy-eyed about people and their intentions. But, Plato said, he said what's wrong with democracy, and it starts out well enough, but in the end, it gets taken over by the rich and by lobbies, by demagogues, and so on. And that's true. But the reason for it is because there is no equality. So what I say about democracy is that democracy is impossible in an unequal system. India today is only very superficially a democracy if there are such great differences between rich and poor and so on. Democracy can work only if no one is rich enough to hijack the state. So what you'd be doing, in fact, I think you would reach a state of real democracy if you were able to ensure not total equality. That's starry-eyed, that there were some fanatics in the Soviet Union in 1920 who asked for that, and even Lenin laughed them out. But if you were to create a situation of relative equality, I said no classes, then you could probably have democracy. You could have a system in which no group could hijack the state. Now, of course, nothing is ever perfect. And just like the social democracy declined, maybe over 200 or 300 years, something would happen and it would, you'd have to go back to it and find a different mix. But I think we would be able to have democracy only if we had relative equality. So, systems that are very unequal are in fact not democratic. And you look at the United States and you see the number of people in prison, etc. You wonder, why are they all so convinced that they're the model of democracy when in fact there's a serious problem?
Yeah, good enough. Pam, you had an interesting question about the role of businessmen.
Right. That's something that worked through the extract that we gave to our participants, as well as the whole book.
Right.
The notion that businessmen have the ear of of the powerful, of course, and labor unions and less powerful people are dismissed. So my question was back when we were discussing COVID, but also when we're discussing the latest race issue, how has the priority given to business played out in those two crises?
Well, business still has tremendous power. COVID, we don't know yet because it's been only 3 months, and the first thing that had to be done and was done was salvaging. Other there would have been social unrest, but remember, I want to keep business and to keep private enterprise. So obviously, I don't think that it's all negative, and that all the idea of incentive or enterprise or whatever should be discounted. But I think in a situation where they do not have a disproportionate influence, the problems will not be the same. And with the race issue in the United States, I think we're concentrating on race because it is glaring, it's frightening, it's terrible. But if we created a relative equality of individuals, the race issue would cease to be the central to the United States. If, I've always said that if my system worked out, 3 or 4 generations would pass and you couldn't find a single white person or a single black person, completely white or completely black in the United States, except a recent immigrant. And that would probably happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right, right.
Here's a comment from a participant, and I'd like to read it to you and have your reactions to it. I'm quoting him. While I like romanticism and am strongly in favor of individual rights and freedoms, I do not think individualism is the answer, but rather cooperativism. Anthropologically and sociologically, humans are by nature cooperative and are altruistic, more so than any other species. Would not an economy based on these values of cooperation be better? One based on worker-owned co-ops, and where land ownership is replaced by community land trusts. Not so much individualism, but individuals working in co-ops, a type of communalism or municipalism or anarchist socialism, but with a big dose of ecology, a social ecology, a la Butchkin.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for that position, but it's been tried and it didn't work. In the 19th century, there were many attempts to form ideal islands where people would live and share everything, including women and so on, or men, and it never worked out. In the end, it didn't work. The Soviet experiment did not work, despite the fact that it was not initially malevolent, but it turned into horror. I think I do believe in cooperation, and remember, one of the pillars of the 5 pillars is a strong public sector. I'm not calling for private ownership of education or private ownership of health or private ownership of culture, though we must make sure that it's not dictated by somebody like Stalin. But I think in the end, attempts to create communal living don't work. Look at, and again, I don't want to get into a debate about it, but especially about that. But Israel started with the kibbutzim, and it was the essence of it. But there's hardly any country that's more right-wing today, that in terms of its electorate, in terms of its insistence of private enterprise and so on. It doesn't work out unless you create equality. And if you create equality, then I think you'll be better off having everybody have his home and his private space and cooperate in the building of the public sector and in redistributing. So I think perhaps the idea that I have is not all that different from the person who posed the question, but I don't like I don't like enforcing collective things. And if you have a commune, what happens when one person likes Mozart and the other one likes loud jazz? And so wouldn't it be better if each of them had his own sound system?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Here's another question. Do you think there needs to be a healthy tension between individualism and the common good it seems to me that too much focus on individualism is problematic. For example, the new medical assistance in dying law totally focuses on individual desire without a willingness to reflect on how this impacts social structures such as hospital systems, palliative care, physicians' sense of their role in healing. How do we navigate these different levels of the good?
I fully agree with you. I think I don't like the assisted suicide. I'm generally the person who feels very strongly about the sanctity of life. So the answer is the same on capital punishment. The answer is the same on anything. Try to maintain life as long as possible. Try to deal with pain. But I think there are limits to individualism, and the limits to individualism are the economic ones. That no one be given the excess power to do what he likes, no matter what you think. The in-your-face person, they won't have the power. The American dream that anybody can be a millionaire. You can all have 12 yachts and a private airplane and a palace somewhere. No, that type of individualism doesn't work. But when it comes to such things as privacy, as freedom of expression, as freedom of your own thinking, etc., I think a hefty dose of individualism is necessary, saying the state will see to the redistribution, but it's not going to regulate the rest.
Mm-hmm. Another question, a person who was concerned about, let's say, a company like Bombardier and the role of the state in providing support for large corporate institutions like Bombardier. To what extent is there a place in the system that you're proposing for government intervention to prop up companies that are in difficulty, not only for the technological spin-offs, but because you want to keep the jobs of people who are the employees, and indeed I'll call it the human resources that have been developed within the company.
Yeah, I agree. I think there would be a place, and I think one of the things that one has to remember is that I don't entirely exclude the possibility of a larger public sector. I'd say it didn't work in the Soviet Union, it didn't, but in the future, some big things, maybe banks, may be subject to will be subject to government regulation, and government regulation may well prop something up. But remember, if it props it up, but there is a rule about what the maximum income is, that the president will not vote himself 20 million out of the state support, that the shareholders will not take everything in dividends and leave the workers with the minimum that is necessary to keep it going. The economic regulation may mean government participation in some of those big things. Where it's dangerous is if the private interests don't have limits, and they're the dominant ones. The partnership, which really works for the benefit of the company and not for the benefit of the people.
Before Pamela and Martin pose another question, here's something from one of our participants. Something that's really up your alley in many ways. The idea of judicial review to the point of frustrating the government is an interesting perspective, especially in context with Vavilov. Meanwhile, there is a real challenge to ensure an adequate accessibility to justice, especially for individuals, not just companies. Therefore, what are your perspectives on preventive judicial measures? For instance, can we apply preventive measures in the Charter of Rights, such as a formal criteria to the notwithstanding clause? Indeed, I believe we can innovate in law the same we can innovate in medicine through efficient preventive public law measures.
Well, I hope I'm involved in it to some extent. I hope the Bill 21 debate does put in some limits on the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause was a bargain which some premiers, and namely Premier Romanov, whom generally I tended to like NDP premiers, but he was wrong in getting that. The notwithstanding clause is not something that I admire. But I think when it comes to judicial review, The difficulty of it in a system such as ours is that the big, the powerful, always have access to the courts. And then, of course, the others can only do it collectively through organizations like ethnic groups or unions or whatever. But in a world in which there isn't billions of dollars there, the individual will be able to challenge. And I think the role of the court is certainly to prevent, it's not to prevent democracy, but it's to prevent populism, to prevent government abuse of power and demagoguery. And therefore, yes, I think judicial review is very important. I was very happy to see Vavilov and a more open approach towards overturning things. But I think if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to make justice accessible. The reason why the doctrine of deference gained a lot of support in the past was because the powerful always had access to justice. So they said, let's not allow judicial review because a little guy doesn't have a chance. But judicial review would be a wonderful thing if the little guy had a chance.
Your comments regarding, government assistance to Bombardier and others have generated some reactions about, indeed scandalous reactions on part of certain people about the government's decision to bail out the Cirque du Soleil. So,
right.
I personally never liked the Cirque du Soleil very much. So I will give you my own. I saw it a couple of times, and I was never all that impressed. But that's not a reason for being for or against. Cultural institutions occasionally have to be bailed out. And there would be no MSO, there would be no opera, or the tickets would be so expensive that it would only be possible if the elite remained extremely rich. And of course, we might democratize opera now that it's going to be broadcast, and for $20 instead of $200, you might have it available for everybody. But the bailing out or the promotion of cultural activities is very important. The only thing is, you have to prevent the type of catastrophe that happened in the Soviet Union, where they also imposed the content. Mm-hmm. And it's usually very good to decentralize it. In other words, you can apply to Quebec or Canada. If Quebec becomes dominated by some avant-gardists, maybe there'll be more conservative people in Ottawa to look at something, or vice versa. What you don't want is to have a dogma which says which cultural things are going to be promoted. And certainly you don't want a nationalist dogma. You don't want somebody saying it'll have to, and by the way, one of the terrible things in recent years has been the claim about cultural appropriation. I think it's obviously reasonable for us to write about other cultures or to act in plays about other cultures, both ways. And so, yes, the state has to bail out culture because culture is unable to generate the income, at least not in this system, but it must not dictate the content. And there must be all sorts of checks and balances to make sure that we, in the old days, it's the Pope who was the patron, and he told them what you could do and what type of depictions were not permitted. Then afterwards, it would have been big business. And then Stalin or whatever. No, we have to have a system which bails out culture, but keeps freedom. I think we come back to the same thing. I want a more socialized system, but I'm afraid of the effect on freedom. So I want the individual freedom to be protected in all of those situations while the state activity continues.
Okay. I have one other comment here, that just disappeared on me. Martin, you had another question, I believe, did you not?
I just had a loose end on multiculturalism. I'm very interested in your thinking on multiculturalism, and based on what your position is, how do you feel the Canadian and respectively the Quebec governments have managed to deal with this issue, and to what extent have they been right or wrong?
In theory, I'm with Quebec on interculturalism as opposed to multiculturalism, in theory. But Quebec, of course, spoils it by an excessive nationalism, by a notion of nous autres. But generally speaking, I think Quebec is closer to the answer in refusing the sort of isolated multiculturalism and yet saying other cultures are welcome. On the other hand, I think Canada, initially people said it doesn't matter. You know, the theory of multiculturalism was that Trudeau came up with it, Trudeau père came up with it because he couldn't sell bilingualism to the West unless he also accompanied it by multiculturalism, and without bilingualism, Canada was gone. There was no way Quebec was going to stay if French was not equal, and rightly so. So, and people said it won't matter very much. Look at Toronto and said, hey, your ideal of mixing is happening. But in the end, what also happened is a growing corporatism. People notice how profitable belonging to a group and mobilizing blocks of voters would be. Blocks of voters who gain nothing from it. I always said that members of ethnic groups would be better off not being in the ethnic group. It's the leaders who benefit. But there is a loyalty that people can't give up. And I always give my own example, which is quite different. I read a lot in Polish. I watch Polish films. I'm interested in, but I don't have the political loyalty. It's not a political loyalty. It's a language or aesthetic one. And I think that's much better. Unfortunately, in Toronto, for instance, people do become English speaking. I mean, third generation people do speak English at home, etc. But they have this loyalty which allows the corporatism to become powerful. And that's not a good thing. I think it's obviously a great thing if people maintain their language of origin, if they read, if they proselytize. I could tell you a number of Polish novelists who I think are unjustly neglected and are on the level of the Russian or the German novelists too, who should be reading them. But that's good. But it is not good to have the corporate.
Okay. Interesting distinction. Pam, did you have anything else?
My last question emerged from the discussion now, although it was in your book, how important judicial review is in order to kind of recalibrate society and how the importance you give to the courts. I think I could buy that in Canada because I have a certain respect for our judicial system and our judicial traditions. But as I see the American courts being packed with right-wingers that are there for years and years and years, I would be very skeptical how your 5 pillars could emerge in that society.
Any packed court is a bad thing. Now, of course, we should not pretend that all judges are, that they lose everything that they ever stood for before when they're named to the bench. So here too, I can tell you, I can tell a person, bad luck, you've got a hanging judge tomorrow, or good luck, she'll let you off if she can. So we do know what judges stand for and so on. But what's happened in the United States is an absolute scandal, where the judiciary has become, like everything else, part of a polarization of society, where people don't speak to each other, and where, for instance, if you listen to them, the naming of judges becomes the most crucial thing. And it'll work both ways. If ever the other side is in there, the most brilliant judge who has doubts about abortion will not be named. Mm-hmm. That would be the first question they'll ask. I actually think that there are ways of making it less political and less, it shouldn't be a totally partisan matter, but we shouldn't have illusions that we're going to get, and perhaps we shouldn't even hope that we're going to get a court of political non-entities who stand for nothing except the law. After all, the law is there's no such thing as the law the way it is, the law the way it's interpreted. Separate but equal was equal in 1894, and it was not equal in 1954. So judges do have prejudices, biases, attitudes, but should not become pawns in a political game that's being played in the US Senate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Obviously, your answers are generating a lot of discussion, and this is leading to interesting questions that are being posed. So if you allow me, there's two questions here I'd like to draw your attention towards. So let's start with the first one. If Canada were to impose the kind of taxation you propose, what would stop investors and entrepreneurs from fleeing to another country whose tax system allows them to keep their private planes? Capital has the memory of an elephant, the speed of a cheetah, and the courage of a doe.
Well,
and we live in a globalized economy with free flows of capital. How can we prevent consigning ourselves to autarky and a level of income and opportunity that most Canadians would find unacceptable?
I'm not certain that
okay, go ahead.
I'm not certain that the level of standard of living would necessarily fall if we had less free trade. I don't believe in free trade as a dogma. I'm not totally against. I discuss free trade. I say free trade between equals is normally better than not free trade. But free trade is far from a panacea. The greatest period of free trade before the present one was 1900 to 1914. And we saw how that ended. And the countries that had the most trade between themselves were Britain and Germany, and didn't stop them from killing 3 million or 2 million of each other citizens for very little reason. So free trade, I think, is something that is not always bad. I don't buy the anti-free trader idea that you've got to protect everything all the time. And certainly cultural goods should be spread and so on as much as possible. But at the same time, free trade is not a dogma. And there are times when you have to stop free trade. We have a good market. And you look at certain countries, now you're going to tell me they have a lot of oil, but Norway has substantially higher prices and substantially higher wages than other countries. And as a result, they live well. People can't go and visit them, unfortunately. It's bad for the tourist industry. But nevertheless, we should not believe that if capital flees occasionally, some other type of entrepreneur will not step into the breach, because we do have a market. We do have certain advantages. For instance, I think Medicare is an advantage that we have over the United States. The United States, they spend a bigger percentage of their gross national product on healthcare, and they don't have care for everybody. I think companies are better off having workers protected in Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver than exposing them to the vagaries of the American system. I do not believe that, therefore, the answer is twofold. Free trade is not a dogma. It's something that's occasionally good and occasionally not. On the other hand, I don't believe, even if some companies flee, that we're going to lose everything. Mm-hmm. Finally, we should do something about tax havens, and we should do something about international agreements. That's what Piketty suggests, the French economist, that we should have an international tax. Now, of course, fat chance with Trump to tax corporations and so on. But perhaps one day a form of cooperation could be established that would diminish further the problem of fleeing capital. So the answer is not, we don't have a solution. Some companies will escape, some capital might leave, but in the end, the market we have is a healthy one. People will invest, even if they do not make millions of dollars, they'll do well and they have an advantage and they'll have a decent life. And they will not be subjected to this frenzy for massive growth, which is not really useful because we can all live without those things. And they should not frighten us by suggesting they're all going to leave. They won't.
So in other words, the United States, Mexico, and Canada free trade agreement is not, in your view, a threat. It is something that, as an international trade agreement, offers advantages both for Canadians and Americans and Mexicans.
But it's also not, yeah, it is. But it's also not a dogma. We can modify it and change it. Remember, in 1945, Britain elected a government which has at its program the nationalization of industry, the creation of universal health care, which they did, the abandonment of the empire, which they did to a large extent, that was finished off later, and so on. and you would have thought capital will flee. Nobody will stay in Britain. All factories will close, etc. Not at all. Britain continued. And the problems that Britain had was in the 60s, when after the fall, the decline of the empire, Britain had some serious difficulties, which it largely solved by joining Europe. And now we'll see what happens to it when it decided to get rid of it. But the 1945 election did not destroy the British economy. And an election of a government dedicated to equality will not destroy the Canadian economy beyond a day or two when some stocks will fall and so on. But afterwards, it'll come back.
Yeah. Pamela, do you have a question that you want to pose at this point?
No, he's gone through all of mine beautifully. I think they're all answered. Thank you.
Well, here's another question that's just I've received just a few minutes ago. One of the effects of the pandemic has been to open a window of possibility in which things that seemed unthinkable 6 months ago are now being tried wholesale. Of the many initiatives that have surfaced in the world in response to the pandemic, which do you think are the most promising, the most hopeful?
Well, there are two obvious things that are very good. One is the socialization, but that happened in 2009 as well. Obama bought out the things and then it was taken away, especially by Trump. But right now, the government has recognized its role. This has not been a capitalist 3 months. It's been a form of social democracy that has been working. But there's something else that's very promising and that I hope we never go back on. And that is the environmental improvement. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, the reduction in the jet fuel in the atmosphere, the closing down of industries means that the water is clean in Venice canals, the air is more fresh everywhere, and so on. I'm not suggesting that we should stop the economy, but I'm suggesting that creating a world in which we stop the frenzy of growth is now possible, and there is an advantage which has become immediately evident. And I think that's the greatest threat. If we don't, I said that at the beginning of the program, I think in 10 years, we're going to have a crisis with the waters rising in Manhattan or Venice or Rio or wherever, that will be completely out of control. I think there are two opportunities. The realization that we don't need everything and we don't need the frenzy, and that the environment can quickly be influenced for the better, and the realization, I hope it's been realized, even though if you read the financial papers, they still haven't learned their lesson. They want to go back as soon as it's over. The realization that the state must be there to protect the weak, to make certain that nobody falls by the wayside. Now, I'm still worried about our corporatism, about the fact that people try to prove, I shuddered when I heard that men are more likely to die than women, because I certainly don't feel like a martyr. I hope I don't die. But I think it's important to understand that everybody's equally concerned, whether, first of all, many women have died, and secondly, losing your husbands or sons or brothers or etc. is as bad in many ways as dying. And I don't want to prove that one group is more affected than another. Of course, scientific research might show us. Some people are arguing that blood type has an effect and so on. So we'll find that out. But the generally positive things that we might learn from the crisis are the redistribution by government, the environment, and the fact that we don't need all of the material goods that people have been striving for. There's an interesting book by the Skidelskis in England about how much is enough. And I think there is a certain limit. How much is enough? And I suggest, for instance, that we invest in leisure time. Many of us have had too much leisure time in recent days, but leisure is important. Rather than producing the extra pair of jeans and the extra hotel or whatever, have more freedom and more time to reflect. So those are things that there could be a silver lining to this cloud.
I was just going to ask that if you felt that the occurrence of the pandemic might lead to a rebirth of the sort of social democracy that you admired in the 50s and 60s.
Not a new rebirth. I don't want to go back to a system which had its faults, but a new birth, a different type of social democracy. I hope so. I hope so. And I think periods of great suffering have often led that. And people have said that the plague of 1348 was in many ways responsible for the Renaissance. And the explanation I've heard was that because there was a labor shortage, landowners would protect another landowner's peasants if they run away to him. So the serfdom system fell apart. And secondly, in places like Italy and Flanders, wages rose. And so ordinary people could afford works of art, could afford a little bit more luxury. And the Renaissance, more slowly than today, the Renaissance arose out of the plague. I don't think it's a direct relationship, but it can be argued. Piketty says the reason for the Trente Glorieuses was the destruction of the two wars. What happened was there was so much capital that was lost during the wars that you had a short period of time when labor was as lucrative as capital, when you could live just as well, and not on a poor salary, but on a salary of an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, you could live just as well as as a rentier. And he used, and Piketty always uses literary examples. He used Balzac and Jane Austen as the examples of the type of thing that you could cure, the dominance of capital. So,
yeah.
So the idea is that you could, yes, great suffering sometimes has led to periods, nothing is eternal, of course, but periods of prosperity and relative justice.
Great.
Il y a un intervenant qui souligne la montée de l'intolérance à l'échelle globale, avec des idiots de droite, même voire l'extrême droite. Quelle est votre explication de ce phénomène, cette montée de l'intolérance? Et ici au Québec, est-ce que nous devrions être inquiets?
Je pense que tout le monde doit être inquiet de l'existence de l'intolérance de l'extrême droite. Ça a toujours existé. On n'a pas inventé. Plusieurs fois, j'ai fait allusion aux élections allemandes en 1933, qui étaient le triomphe de ce genre de mal personnifié. Cependant, je pense que la période néolibérale a augmenté l'intolérance, puisque, ayant perdu l'espoir d'avoir une société plus juste, plus équitable, les gens se sont réfugiés à l'intérieur de leur groupe. D'abord parce que les groupes allaient être leurs représentants dans la compétition pour ce qui restait. Et deuxièmement, parce qu'il n'y avait plus l'espoir d'une société, si vous voulez, universelle. Dans le monde arabe, par exemple, c'est clair que les déclins du socialisme arabe, qui n'a jamais été parfait, je ne suis pas un admirateur de Nasser, loin de là, mais qui faisait certaines choses, a fait en sorte que c'était les partis musulmans qui faisaient le bien-être social, qui distribuaient. Et c'est la même chose chez nous. Alors nous devons être inquiets. Mais une des choses que je souligne dans mon livre, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de nationalisme de gauche. Il y a des situations où il y a un mouvement progressiste national pour une courte période. Et parfois, pour des raisons spécifiques à une société, ils prennent le pouvoir pour une courte période. Donc, René Lévesque était progressiste et il y avait un gouvernement de gauche, centre-gauche nationaliste. Les partis Mapai étaient socialisants, il y avait un certain socialisme israélien. En Algérie, il y avait une gauche nationale en 1965, mais partout, le nationalisme va vers la droite. La position naturelle du nationalisme est à droite. Il faut se méfier toujours de cette loyauté aveugle, nous autres, de la notion de nous qui exclut.
Est-ce que cela expliquerait le succès de Donald Trump dans sa quête de la présidence des États-Unis? Est-ce que dans les éléments que vous avez identifiés, est-ce que cela explique pourquoi Trump est arrivé au pouvoir?
En partie, faisons que l'Amérique devienne grande, c'est sûrement genre un slogan, ça renforce ma position contre le multiculturalisme. Pour un homme, un ouvrier en Pennsylvanie ou à Ohio, il ne voyait pas ce qu'il avait à gagner des élites donc la seule idée était les groupes, que ce soit le féminisme, qui en soi est une très bonne chose, mais où l'idée était la promotion de certains groupes. Et ils se sont posé la question, et nous, qui me défend? Et bien sûr, ce n'est pas Donald Trump, ce n'est pas plus les mouvements de droite en Europe, ce n'est pas Mme Le Pen qui va défendre la classe ouvrière française qui a perdu le Parti communiste comme défendeur et qui maintenant pense qu'elle va exclure les immigrants. C'est une fausse idée d'aller vers la droite, mais la droite gagne parce qu'elle réussit à stimuler ce genre de nationalisme.
So you will not be surprised if I receive the question, and be phrased this way: will Joseph Biden win in November?
Well, you know, I don't have a crystal ball. I think he probably will. It's judged by the polls right now. However, you remember that the other guy has the control. He can cut taxes at the last moment. He can announce programs at the last moment. Biden has an infinite capacity for making silly remarks. So you just don't know 5 months in advance whether he's going to win. In general, it's very difficult. The idea that you can predict the short run of politics is incorrect. You can predict the long run. If you ask yourself, what could Queen Elizabeth have done to prevent the growth of capitalism? The answer is nothing. Whatever she did, whatever head she cut off, whatever prince she named as her successor, it would have happened. But the immediate election in November of this year, anything can happen. And I wouldn't underestimate Trump because nobody believed he was going to win last time. And he still has that crazy appeal to people who have no interest in having him. The worker in Pennsylvania would be better off with somebody else, even if they have those obsessions with identity, than with Donald Trump. And the people who are in prison, people go for law and order, forgetting that it's their sons, their brothers, who are going to be spending 20, 30 years in penitentiaries afterwards. So people vote against their interest, but they might do it again. I'm not sure about France. That's what worries me very much, that Madame Le Pen will take it. It could take it in a moment of despair.
Yeah.
Martin, you had another question, I believe.
No, I think that was it, Brian. Thank you.
Okay.
It was about the social democracy question.
Okay. Well, related to the social democracy point, one person posed a question if he had any thought about the Great Reset idea that was expressed at the Davos Economics Summit. This is something that you're familiar with, the Great Reset idea.
Well, every year when they go to Davos, they have these great ideas and so on. But I, generally speaking, don't believe that in anything that comes out of Davos. I think Davos is the place where the owners of the new neoliberal world, whether they're considered center-left like Blair or center-right like some of the like the Bushes, they go there and they talk. It's not out of Davos that you're going to get that. It's out of, I think, electorates realizing what's in their
one
interest.
perhaps final question that has been posed. You'll recall that Pierre Trudeau had initiated a white paper seeking to encourage Indigenous people in Canada to become citizens of Canada and in many ways eschew their indigenous identity. You'll recall that this generated quite a bit of resistance among the different indigenous nations coast to coast. And indeed, this matter has been raised not only as a follow-up to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. What are your thoughts about the future of indigenous nations as entities, especially since a large number of their people are finding themselves in urban centers? There's a great deal of intermarriage. Do you have a vision or a kind of some insights regarding the relationship between Canada and the various sovereign indigenous nations?
I think Trudeau and Chrétien were essentially correct in those days in trying to integrate, and that's been lost, and it's not happening right now. But the answer really is not in taking away cultures or anything like it. After all, freedom of association means that you can be in your group, and there's nobody that should be able to stop you or enforce it. But the problem is an economic one, and let's go back to Karl Marx. Can one successfully live and educate one's children by the type of programs, the types of way of making a living that traditional Aboriginal ways promoted? Can you do it by hunting, fishing, even if you get the resources and you'll have some money? And the answer surely is that it's not adapted to that. But there is a great wealth of knowledge, of legend, of myth that could be brought in, just like Lady Murasaki, could be brought into all of us, and we could all appreciate the success. But if you're going to I think one of the scandals of Canada today is the life expectancy, low life expectancy, the fact that so many children are in youth protection among the Aboriginals, the fact they're the First Nations, the fact that there are so many who are poor, ill, and I went to some of those communities, and what I found was really unacceptable, given the wealth and relative wealth that we have here. And to my mind, the answer is not that we should repudiate what they have, but that we should integrate it along with them, so that their children have the same opportunity as our children. That it no longer, sometimes go into a courtroom and you find, especially in Vancouver, but even here, so many First Nation people as accused, or the youth protection, or whatever. I think that has to stop. And once again, there's the eternal conflict between the leaders and the people. The leaders have an interest in maintaining the thing right now, maintaining them as you remember the debate, the strikes, the blockades that we had earlier this year. And the people, where the democratically elected band councils didn't want to do that. I think in the end, we have to ask ourselves the following question, two questions. How can we keep and share the Aboriginal cultures? And how can we ensure that we share also our prosperity and healthcare and education with them? And that's
those are very, very good points. Here's somebody who's drawn my attention to the fact that I have not posed the question they had formulated. And this is the question they have. How does globalization fit into romantic individualism? You've alluded to it on a couple of occasions, but the person feels that that question has not been really dealt with to their satisfaction.
Well, globalization is a thing that has two sides. It's like under communism. Of course, I make the comparison between the two systems. There was such a thing as internationalism, and they used to call it proletarian international. It wasn't all bad. When you went into a Soviet bookstore, and I speak Russian, I used to go to those bookstores, and never saw any place which had so many translations of French, German, Polish, any novels for their population. So there was such a thing as internationalism. Internationalism is a good thing. Nationalism is not. But on the other hand, globalism became bad in the same way that Soviet, for instance, and East German nationalism over sport events, over competitions, over everything else, became ultimately stultifying and unjust. So globalization is a good thing insofar as we put down barriers between people, as we allow people to meet each other internationally as well as internally. Globalization is not a good thing if it's globalization for capital and not for labor. One of the things we've noticed in the neoliberal period is that immigration is unpopular. People want to keep other people out, etc. It's capital they want. And what we want, if we're going to have internationalism, it's going to be a human internationalism. It's going to be people knowing each other and so on, and not capital internationalism, so that people can speculate on the stock exchanges of Tokyo, Moscow, Berlin in the course of one day. So internationalism, yes. Globalization is a much exaggerated good, just as the internationalism of the Soviet Union had something to recommend it, but its ultimate national chauvinism did not.
Professor Grey, the session has been very, very rich, and I salute you for your ability to answer all kinds of questions that point to the importance, the significance of what you've been writing in your recent book. And so I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the Thomas More Institute to thank you for your contribution. And certainly you have aroused my curiosity and my desire to perhaps pay a little bit more attention to Polish literature. So thank you very much. I want to thank you for that. I also want to point out that I really salute in many, many ways the questions that were prepared by Dr. Pam Butler and Mr. Barton Baenninger, questions that I think put our discussion on the right track. And thank you for your work in developing the structure, the framework for such an interesting evening. I would
like to thank, and let me thank you, both the people who posed the questions and the public. And I can say I thoroughly enjoyed the evening.
Great. So
we're delighted. We're delighted. I should point out that this particular webinar will be available on YouTube, and I invite people to perhaps revisit our discussion, because there are a lot of points there that were dense and worthwhile revisiting. And of course, it'd be worthwhile purchasing the book that Professor Grey has written, and to look at those, especially that chapter there with the 5 principles, I think are very challenging, and to see how those principles might be indeed translated into public policy. I think those are important questions that need to be looked at carefully. I also should point out to all the persons that are in attendance that you will be sent a survey about the webinar. We want to know, well, what did you think of this evening? Did it work? Do you want to have more of these? And if so, what would be the kind of questions, topics you would like us to engage with? And perhaps that might be an opportunity for us to invite Maître Julius Grey back again for one or other question that might look at, for example, where are we at with the Charter of Canadian Rights and Freedoms 50 years later? It might be worthwhile having such a conversation. So I'm just putting that as an idea, recognizing the unique contribution that you have to our deliberations. So with that, I'd like to also, I think it's proper that I should thank the board of the Thomas More Institute, and notably the president, Carol Fiedler, and Mrs. Zoe Shaw and Jonathan Powers for their work behind the scenes that make this evening happen. Without Zoe, without Jonathan, and without the board of directors, this kind of evening would not happen. So I want to salute these people. And once again, Maître Grey, je vous remercie de tout cœur de votre présence, vos interventions pertinentes, percutantes, et les questions que vous avez voulu souligner et que nous portons maintenant grâce à votre présentation ce soir.
Merci.
Merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.